everybody. Today I thought I'd give you a brief lecture that's going to kind of tie in all the different parts we did in Module 3. As you know, in Module 3 we started to talk about the body and the ways in which various discourses construct our notions of gendered and raced bodies, right? So in this unit in particular, we were focusing on science and scientific narratives of gender, and also, later in this unit, we were also talking about the ways in which race intersects with any understanding of gender itself. So one of the things I want to start with here is to talk about how science itself is seen as objective, and this picture of science as objective, in fact, can make it very difficult for us to understand how deeply gendered and raced scientific language can be. And so for that reason, we start with Emily Martin's The Egg and the Sperm. And in that article, she talks about how the language of science itself is sexist. The ways in which most of us learned about eggs and sperms really reinforce gendered understandings of behavior. The egg is seen as little men, the egg is seen as little women, and the sperm is seen as little men, so that the cells themselves become gendered. And the way they talk about biological processes, in fact, reinforces sexist narratives of women as passive and men as active, of women as sedentary and men as actively choosing their partners. We all know cells don't actually have gender, but the ways in which we talk about them works to construct gendered understandings of bodies themselves, right? And so one of the things that she also sort of begins to touch on, but is really fleshed out by Anne Fausto Sterling, is the way in which we often separate understandings of sex from understandings of gender. And when we separate out these understandings, we often think of sex as the biological and gender as the social. And while I think that's a useful distinction in many ways, our common sense understanding of this is that sex comes first, that there are two sexes and we map a binary gender system onto those sexes. But as Anne Fausto Sterling and Ricky Wilchins argue, we in fact need to switch that around. We live in a society with a deeply binary gender system, and that is why we also have a binary understanding of sex. So Fausto Sterling is thinking about intersex bodies and the pressure on the medical profession and on parents to choose the gender and sex of their babies before they're even 24 hours old, because there's a sense that our world would be so uncomfortable with the reality of intersex issues, with the reality of the fact that people's bodies may or may not fit neatly into this binary system, that they really are pushing this binary sex system on people. And as Fausto Sterling emphasizes, what gender or sex somebody is always a social decision. We cannot answer those questions with science. These are really about social understandings of what these terms mean. In order to further understand it or to further explore our understanding of what these terms mean, Wilchins really wants to talk about how our understandings of gender and sex are performative, right? She argues that when we express gender, we are reinforcing a sense of gender identity, that gender is made up of a series of identifications. It's not about some interior essence that we're just expressing, but it really is about certain kinds of behaviors, that the more we act out being a woman or being a man or being non-binary, then the more these come true as our identifications. So we're really trying to move away from thinking about gender and sex as something that is inside us coming out, and rather we're thinking about the ways in which cultural discourses themselves map them onto our bodies. Wilchins is thinking particularly about trans folk and non-binary people, right? To think about the ways in which, obviously, for people whose gender and sex and sexual practices and gender identities don't meet up, they don't line up neatly, that it's more obvious the ways in which gender and sex are socially constructed. But I think it's really important for us to think about that these are not only true for people who are trans or non-binary, but that they're true for everybody. That for cis people, gender is socially constructed, even if they fit more neatly into cultural norms. And the same is true for people who are heterosexual, say, or for people whose identities follow what we think of as mainstream American norms. So Wilchins also wants to talk about the ways in which these kinds of behaviors and understandings are not natural, they're not inherent, they are in fact deeply representative of our cultural understandings, and that these cultural understandings are validated and reinforced through science, through the media, through the medical system, through the legal system, all of these sort of social institutions that reinforce a binary gender and sex understanding. So while they're talking about gender and sex and trans and intersex in sort of very general terms, and they're not talking specifically about how these identities are raced and classed, one of the things I hope we've learned earlier in this semester is that all such identities depend deeply on race and class. In Boy I Am, for instance, when we talk about trans men, we can think very much about how Nori is arguing that becoming a black man is a very terrifying prospect in certain ways, while he feels compelled to change his body to reflect his ontological understanding or phenomenological understanding of his gender in the world. He also recognizes that becoming a black man also carries with it a whole lot of cultural baggage. When we read Brett Staples or the Ritzkus piece, we think about the ways in which black masculinity is read as inherently threatening in our society. And the perception of black men as threatening also makes black men endangered in our society. It seems really, really important to talk about this at this cultural moment with the rise of a renewed movement against state violence, to think about the ways in which this state violence targets blackness, but also targets black masculinity, and to some extent black femininity. We often don't talk as much about the ways in which black trans women and black women are also subject to state violence, but black men are subject to state violence through this logic of being seen as a threat. So Staples talks about how he has to be really, really careful when he's walking at night, that he doesn't want to scare people, and he recognizes that he's perceived as threatening. And Ritzkus talks about the ways in which black bodies are read as excess, that it is blackness itself that is perceived as threatening. And his analysis of the murders of Mike Brown, Tamir Rice, and Eric Garner talk about the ways in which cultural understandings of this violence often target the bodies of black men themselves. And we've seen that in current instantiations as well, where people say, well, if they were in better shape, if they weren't diabetic, if they weren't fat, then they would not have died. And of course, his response and our response is, no, if they were not subject to police violence, they would not have died. That you can't put the blame on people's bodies for them not being able to survive police brutality. So I think it's really important for us to think about the ways in which this construction of the body works for trans people, works for cis people, works in a whole lot of different ways to construct our notions of racialized gender. And the final piece I wanted to mention today was also to think about the ways in which black trans communities and trans communities of colors have also created cultural responses to such ongoing violence. We're probably aware of the kinds of police violence and the kinds of other and non-police violence, extra police violence, that poor trans women of color in particular are subject to. But I wanted us to watch part of Pose so that we could also see how trans communities of color have really created alternative ways of being in the world. Through the ball culture, through the creation of families, trans communities of color have created culture and cultural production that valorizes their identities and fights back against the white supremacy and the cis heteronormativity that subject them to so much violence. So I wanted us to look at all of these different examples of the ways in which bodies themselves in our society are gendered, are sexed, are raced, are classed, so that we can think about, when we think about sexism and racism, etc., we can think about the intensity of the cultural pressure that creates our bodies themselves to sort of either fit into or resist these kinds of categories. And next week we're going to talk about the role of the media in all this. That is a whole nother topic that's going to, help us think about the intensity and the variety of ways in which these cultural discourses operate. Thank you.